Hello there and a very warm welcome to this special edition of Brass Tacks, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. We're overlooking the beautiful Capitol Hill building on my left, and of course the White House is just a couple of blocks away. Today is the third and final day of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States. A whole host of deals have been signed on, from space technology cooperation to jet engine technology transfer to drones that are being purchased, and of course consulates being opened in each other's countries. So a lot of deals have been signed on. Today, though, is the day for technology. As we speak, the Prime Minister is meeting with the who's who of the technology world, the biggest names in corporate America, in tech America, from Tim Cook to Sundar Pichai to Satya Nadella. They are all meeting right now with Prime Minister Modi and President Biden in what is being called a tech roundtable or a tech handshake event at the White House. From India, it's been represented by Mukesh Ambani, Anand Mahindra, Nikhil Kamath. They're all there for this tech roundtable that's happening right now in the White House. So, what can we expect on the third and final day? And more importantly, how is this visit going to be judged? 10 years down the line, when you look at this visit by Narendra Modi to the United States, his first ever state visit, how may history judge the events of the last 3 days? But first, what we have seen, the incredible scenes over the last 24 hours.
Cheers.
We were strangers in defense cooperation at the turn of century. Now, the United States has become one of our most important defense partners.
The relationship with India really cross-cuts all sectors, public and private, whether it's economy, science, engineering, emerging tech. So, I mean, there's just an awful lot of cross-pollination here in trade and tech that I just think augurs really, really well for this partnership going forward.
When I first visited the U.S. as a Prime Minister, India was the 10th largest economy in the world. Today, India is the 5th largest economy. In modern India, women are leading us to a better future. India grows while being responsible about our planet. We became the only G20 country to meet its Paris commitment. We protected our people with 2.2 billion doses of made in India COVID vaccines, and that too free cost. लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारे रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं। लोकतंत्र के मूलभूत मूल्यों को आधार लेकर के बने हुए संविधान के आधार पर चलती है। जब आप डेमोक्रेसी कहते हैं, जब डेमोक्रेसी को स्वीकार करते हैं और जब हम डेमोक्रेसी को लेकर के जीते हैं, तब डिस्क्रिमिनेशन का कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता है।
So there was a lot of chatter around democracy and Mr. Modi's government's track record when it comes to minority rights and religious freedoms, etc. But that is just one very small divergence, if I may even use that word, in this relationship. More than 99% of this relationship between India and the United States is being defined by convergence. So I spoke to a very special guest. Admiral John Kirby is the communications in charge for the National Security Council, one of the top members of Joe Biden's national security team. And I asked him, what is the big takeaway from this visit? Yes, people are talking about technology transfer in defense. People are talking about, easing up the visa processes for Indians and Americans. But what is the one big defining sort of takeaway of this visit? This is Admiral John Kirby speaking exclusively to CNN News 18. All right, so it's been what many are describing a watershed visit by Prime Minister Modi to the White House. I have with me the coordinator for strategic communication of the National Security Council, Admiral John Kirby. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Great to be with you.
The headline seems to be the jet engine deal between GE and HAL. Could you throw some more light on, how many numbers of engines are we talking about, and how long do you see the congressional process, the approvals for this to go through?
Well, we're going to work with Congress to push this through and to completion as soon as possible. I couldn't give you an exact time frame. And as for the numbers, I think that's really going to be up to the two companies to speak to. But let's not lose the forest for the trees here. This is a significant, as you said, a significant deliverable by General Electric and by both of our countries to allow for co-production of these jet engines, which are the best in the world and will have an enormous impact, not just on capabilities inside India, military and civilian aviation, but also, as Prime Minister Modi said, creating jobs for both of our countries. So a really key moment. We're really proud that this came together for the state visit, but it wasn't just the jet engines either.
Yeah.
It was cooperation on space and the Artemis Accords. It was improving people-to-people ties. India is now going to buy more than 30 MQ-9 drones, which will help their military capabilities using those American drones. I could go on and on. There was just so much that these two leaders agreed to.
So just on the defense partnership itself, the buying of the drones, now the jet engines, would you now characterize this more less as a transactional buyer-seller relationship and more of a knowledge partnership or a technology partnership?
Absolutely. I mean, the relationship with India really cross-cuts all sectors, public and private, whether it's economy, science, engineering, emerging tech. One of the things that the two leaders talked about was building more resilient supply chains for semiconductors. And India's investing more in American semiconductors. We're investing more in some clean energy technology that India's working on. So, I mean, there's just an awful lot of cross-pollination here in trade and tech that I just think augurs really, really well for this partnership going forward.
Could you give us some more specifics on the semiconductor part? We've heard about the Micron deal, but is there anything more specific you can share on what the nature of this cooperation is?
Well, I think we're still going to work out some of the details going forward, but remember what happened during the pandemic, and that was where we all of us, India included, really saw the fragility of the supply chain process. And what we're trying to do here with India is make that supply chain much more resilient to those kinds of shocks. And that means we've got, India has such a bright and viable high-tech industry. And we want to be able to tap into that innovation and that thinking, so that both of our supply chains, should there be another pandemic, should there be another shock to the international system, doesn't fall victim.
So, last couple of questions. One on the H-1B, and one of the concerns, this was one of the pain points for Indian Americans, techies who are living and working here, that they had to leave the country to renew their H-1Bs and come back to get the stamp. I believe that's being relooked at. Could you give us some details?
I don't have an update for you on that. That's really a better question for the State Department.
All right. Final word. There was a question that was asked today to the Prime Minister and to the President about concerns regarding India's human rights record, its religious freedom record, and so on. Do you have any concerns about India's record when it comes to treatment of religious minorities, press freedom, etc.?
I think President Biden addressed this during the press conference, and he talked about the fact that, one of the things that close friends and partners can do is have these kinds of candid discussions. And as the President said, they did have that kind of a discussion today. Human rights are a cornerstone of President Biden's foreign policy, and we never shy away from expressing those concerns to any foreign leader that we're talking about. But when you have mutual respect, when you value each other and each other's democratic systems, you can have those kinds of conversations, and you can work together to see, what can be done to continue to advance the very vibrant democracy that India has. I mean, it didn't get a lot of headlines, but one of the most important outcomes of this bilateral discussion today was improving people-to-people ties. And when you have two democracies, the most populous and the oldest, with a young population in each country that really want to innovate, they really want to advance, they really want to prosper, focusing on the democratic institutions that underpin that, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, all of that makes that innovation so much better. So it's really to both of our advantages that we can have those kinds of discussions.
So that was Admiral John Kirby from the National Security Council here at the White House, giving us his assessment of what to make of this visit and what are the takeaways of this visit. I also now want to go across to a very special guest who is joining us, university professor at the Columbia University and somebody who's been very closely tracking the Indo-US partnership for the last many decades, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on this special edition of Brass Tacks, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. You know, the trajectory of the Indo-US bilateral relationship over the last 20 years, I think one watershed, of course, was 2005-06, when the Indo-US civil nuclear deal was signed. And then you had another big moment when Prime Minister Modi came in 2014 for his first visit to the United States as Prime Minister. And in the last 9 years, the engagement across multiple administrations, whether it was with President Obama, then President Trump, and now with President Biden, Prime Minister Modi seems to have been able to forge some kind of a friendship, some kind of a linkage across these three presidencies, across these three administrations, and with these three individuals as president. How much do you see from whatever you've seen of this visit and what we've seen in the last many visits that the Prime Minister has undertaken over multiple administrations? How much of his personal equation, charisma with these leaders is driving this relationship?
Well, I'm, of course, very glad to see good relations between the United States and India. But I also look to India to help promote good relations across the whole world. India has the presidency of the G20. That brings together really the core of the world economy. And at a time of such stress where U.S.-China relations are very stressed and dangerous. And of course, U.S.-Russia relations don't exist now other than at war. I hope that Prime Minister Modi will use his leadership skills, which are enormous, to promote global cooperation, not only India-U.S. cooperation.
I want to talk a little bit about US-India, particularly on the trade front. And I think the buzz here in Washington is, you know, this is a defining moment. This is an inflection point in the bilateral between Washington and Delhi, because both sides, certainly from the leadership downwards, are giving this message that America is willing to take the same bet, make the same investment in India over the next 10, 20, 30 years, like it did with China in the late 1970s when Deng Xiaoping was the Chinese leader. And you saw the economic transformation of China over the last 30 years. Today, as you said, given where things stand between Washington and Beijing and between Washington and Moscow, is that something that you see as an economic leapfrog moment, both for the US and India? As President Biden said yesterday at the state dinner, America's future is intertwined with India's future, certainly economically speaking. Do you see that sort of leapfrogging in the next decade or so?
Well, of course, there should be good, strong economic relations, but it's obvious the U.S. also wants to use India in the U.S. supposed fight with China. India does not want to be used by anybody. India stands on its own. India should have good relations within the BRICS, meaning with Russia, with China, with South Africa, with Brazil, as well as good relations with the U.S. But the U.S. aims to put India against American opponents. I think, of course, India knows this. Indian leaders know this. India doesn't want to be used and could never be used by the United States for these purposes, but that's the idea of the Quad arrangement and so forth, that somehow India will become a bulwark for US-led geopolitics. This, to my mind, is extremely naive, especially since India is so much larger than the United States in population, of course. It's almost 5 times larger. And because India has interests in good relations with Russia, with China, with other parts of the world. So I just think it's important to understand the U.S. motivation is a little one-sided. And India's motivation, I think, is to have good relations with all parts of the world.
One of the core areas, and we saw one of the big deals that were announced yesterday, was in the field of defense cooperation, not just a transactional one, a buyer-seller one, but transfer of technology, the jet engine deal. Given the complex geopolitical situation, the war in Ukraine, and of course, you know, India's dependence traditionally on Russia for its military supply chains, do you see that changing because of the war, and India will be far less dependent on Russian military parts and supplies, let's say 10 years from now, as it was, as compared to 10 years ago? And also, how does the China threat play in all of this? Many are saying the reason why there is this almost intertwined defense relationship between the US and India is because of China. China is the unsaid factor in the room.
Well, I think India needs to be careful about signing up to something it doesn't want to sign up to, which is to be some kind of junior partner in a US military alliance. Because my own view is the U.S. is on the wrong track right now. The U.S. still aims for a kind of global leadership, which I think is naive, because the U.S. should just be one of several centers of global power in a truly multipolar world, India being one of them, China being another, European Union being another, United States being another. I hope the African Union, as an integrated Africa, will become another in the future. India does not want to become part of the U.S. military alliance. Heaven forbid for India. India wants to have its own regional interests and national interests, but especially the interest of a multipolar world. The United States is against a multipolar world. The United States wants U.S. dominance, which again is out of date and naive. And India should, of course, be fully aware of the U.S. motivations.
You had also recently said, Professor Sachs, that the U.S. is unnecessarily hyping up the China threat. And I'm just curious to know of that in the context of India and China, because India's had its own troubles with China since 2020. There was aggression at the northern borders. There was an attempt to unilaterally change the status quo, and India's responded measure for measure. How does India then, take on this China threat? Because the argument, the other side to the argument that you've put forth is that India cannot take on China on its own right now, which is why it needs the United States to project power more than its capabilities right now. Maybe its capabilities will increase manifold in the next decades, but right now, for it to be able to stand up to China, it needs the help of the United States. So what would you say to that?
India's strategy should be to negotiate with China, to discuss. India is the only country that can say to China, you're smaller than we are in terms of population. So India is a vast country, a great civilization, an ancient and great global culture. So India should sit down with China and say, look, we have tensions on our northern borders in the Himalayan region. We need to resolve those because we have so much at stake in cooperation. We have so much potential in trade, in technology. We have so much need to work together on issues like climate change that these border tensions need to be put past us. So to my mind, there's no way of doing this other than through negotiation.
All right, Professor Sachs, I'll get a final word from you before we open this up to our panelists. Just on the India story, you have seen the trajectory of India, the economic story of India change over the last 10 years. It's now a $3.5 trillion economy. It's the number 5 biggest economy in the world, overtaking Britain recently. What is the future course as you see it for India? Are you bullish on India as the next big emerging power, possibly the 3rd biggest economy by the end of this decade? I
think India's dynamism is absolutely real. And what's happening is that India is really making excellent use of the digital revolution and of green technologies. So right now, India is massively expanding digital access. It is massively creating digital platforms, which I think will be transformative for healthcare, for education. They already are transformative for payments and finance and government services and licensing. India, I believe, will become one of the world leaders in renewable energy, especially solar power. And thanks goodness for that, because India is also highly vulnerable to the global climate change. India is growing roughly at 7% per year, according to the typical GDP measures. That means a doubling every decade. This is absolutely feasible. In fact, I would say it's rather necessary for India. India could even go farther in a world that is peaceful and growing and avoiding conflict. So I think India has big stakes in the overall peacefulness of the world economy and resisting the very naive talk in the United States about decoupling and so forth. This is not in any way realistic or even safe for the world. So yes, I'm very bullish. I believe that India is in a dramatic phase of upswing. I want to see India's education system really perform with excellence in the coming quarter century. This is where China's strength has been phenomenal. China, within a generation, dramatically lifted the quality of education. And now you see it when you see the rankings of research outputs of major institutions. China is now usually 5 of the top 10 in technology. Now, India, of course, can get in there in its full fair share, but that's a major investment in educational upgrading and expanding the university systems and the technology and research systems. But I'm also very happy that many of India's great companies, Reliance and Tata and others, are making big investments in the new technologies, and this is very important and very gratifying.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, for joining us with your thoughts and perspective on how you see the trajectory of the US-India relationship over the next few decades in what many are calling an inflection point right now, and especially in the context of the Prime Minister's visit here to Washington, D.C. Joining us now on a very special panel on this very special show that's live from Washington, D.C. Is G. Parthasarathy, former Indian ambassador to Pakistan. We have Raymond Vickery, who's a senior associate, the Wadhwani chair at the U.S.-India Policy Studies, and Nicole Brenner-Schmitz is a Democrat strategist. Let me start with you, Ambassador Parthasarathy. While everybody here is so bullish on U.S. and India and the transformative sort of potential of this partnership over the next many decades, I guess it's important also to try and draw the limits of this partnership. For example, as much as there is defense cooperation and transfer of technology, etc., India and the United States are never going to be treaty allies. They're never going to be military allies. And you must have seen this Ashley Tellis piece, which is making a lot of people uncomfortable here in the Beltway, in the Washington Beltway, and that is that if push came down to shove, and if the US and China were to go to war over Taiwan, India is not going to get militarily involved. So while it's all milk and honey and sugar, should we also not acknowledge the limits to this partnership?
Look, we've got a good thing started. I remember when I was in Washington, having Mrs. Gandhi's time and watching summits and hearing and looking at them. But let me tell you, what I saw over the last 3 days, I could never imagine in my days when I was in the US that we would have such an easy, friendly relationship at the level of the heads of government and state. And I think that is important. The other point, I think, in this visit was we involved people. The address to the Congress, the presence of the growingly large Indian community who have done both America and India proud. I think the right atmosphere now exists for it. Yes, we are don't get involved in conflicts of others. That's a fact of life, and especially in the case of Ukraine, I think we would just think of peace, and there are easy diplomatic solutions if everybody gets into it. And I'm sure we'll work more with the U.S. My point really is, Zaka, this visit went without controversy. The PM was very well received by the US Congress at the White House, and it has set I think, the mood and the leading businessmen he met. Because let me tell you now, for us, the US has been possibly the major partner in global economic relations. But right now, I think we're giving concrete shape. And here I would attribute to two. First, I think once the Americans get in and cooperate with us on semiconductors, electronics is the future of India. And you can have no one better than the Americans to cooperate with us. And semiconductors will change Indian industry upside down and put us up there in electronics. Then I think in the case of security, yes, these we have not discussed in public, but certainly we are cooperating in the Quad and the other, with the U2I2, where we brought even the Israelis and the UAE and Arab country together to cooperate in West Asia. So there is a commonality of interest in what they call the Middle East, we call West Asia. There is, I think, a commonality of interest
let me bring in,
and dealing with China.
Let me talk about that China aspect. Raymond Vickery is joining us. When it comes to China, and again, many say, you know, that was the elephant in the room. That's the one that is sort of the fear of China, and a growing and assertive China is what is driving this relationship because, you know, as the old adage goes, an enemy's enemy is a friend. But be that as it may, will the US-India relationship stand on its own if the China threat were not to be there? I mean, India has its own fair share of troubles with China, and we've seen that in the last 3 years since Galwan 2020. That has still not been resolved. Is there a feeling that, as Jeffrey Sachs said a moment ago, the US needs India to take on the China threat? There is no other country that's large enough, which has the potential, which has the military, which has the economic capacity to be able to be a counterbalance to China. And at the same time, India too has its own limitations currently in its own set of capabilities, militarily speaking, or even economically speaking. It cannot take on China on its own, and therefore it needs to use the shoulders of the US, if you will, if I were to borrow a phrase. So is that sort of fear of China and how to take on China, you know, combine forces, put your efforts together and thereby take on China, is that what is driving both of these countries to come closer and closer to each other?
Well, thanks for having me. Yes, I think it is the elephant in the room, and it is a major driver in terms of the security aspect of the relationship. It is no question that with China claiming an entire Indian state, Arunachal Pradesh, as well as other territories of India, that has to be of great concern. But beyond the territorial ambitions of China, not only with India, but in the South China Sea in terms of a string of pearls, of ports in Sri Lanka and around the Indian Ocean, those are all of mutual concerns to the United States and India. But what is, it seems to me, driving the relationship as well is democratic values, the rule of law, the respect for the UN Charter. And we have a long way to go in the US-India relationship in that regard, because freedom is indivisible around the globe. Prime Minister Modi has acknowledged the one family aspect of the G20. And so what we have to do is to figure out ways that India will, in its own interest and in concert with its own values, step up as a great leader, a great nation, a great power around the world. It is not the case that you can say, well, Ukraine is over there in Europe and I don't have to worry about that. And I'm not particularly concerned about Taiwan. So if China takes that, you know, there is the old saw about they came for the others and then they came for me. So we have a mutual interest in peace and stability that can only be accomplished by a strong relationship across the board. Economic driver has been there since India did away with the license Raj, or did away partially with it in the 1990s. And when I worked with Secretary Brown to bring a delegation. So this partnership is, yes, across the board, and China is a primary security driver. But the United States and India have relations and interests across the globe.
But Nicole Brenner-Smith, you know, just taking off from what Mr. Vickery said, it's not like India and the United States are going to agree on every issue. I mean, when you say shared values or shared interests, when it comes to Ukraine, I don't think there is anything shared. I mean, India has made it amply clear that India's top priority is a growing economy with a large consumer base, one of the largest consumers of oil and gas, for example. You know, various ministers have made it clear that their priority is to get the cheapest fuel available. And if that means importing from Russia, that means importing from Russia. Is that something that the United States will have to learn to live with, that you're not going to get complementarities in every aspect or every part of this relationship? There will be divergences, and this is one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I don't think the U.S. is coming into this with an expectation of having a NATO allyship type relationship with India. But none of these things live in a silo either, right? The Russia-Ukraine is not in one bucket that's separate from, frankly, our strategic interests that certainly converge over the issue of China to the technology development. These things are all bleed into each other and are a part of each other and push and pull on each other. So that's the purpose here. I mean, this has been a long game of a relationship, which, I mean, you can really look at starting almost with the Clinton administration that has gone through then, you know, Bush and Obama and Trump and many iterations of this. But the Biden administration is continuing what they think is the most strategic path, because we have this great concern over China right now. And while the administration has treated this visit as a really a welcome and a red carpet rollout with a state dinner and his second address to the Congress, there were some liberal Democrats who boycotted the speech. There have been some more progressive organizations that have staged some protests. And the media in the U.S. has covered this aspect of the visit as well. So, you know, other perspectives have been portrayed here. But what the administration and the majority of Congress is doing is saying this is a relationship that is multifaceted and needs to grow and continue.
I want to talk about that a little bit, and I'll get your views first before I go to Ambassador Parthasarathy for what is the India view on this. The Prime Minister was asked a question, the President was asked a question about, you know, the Indian government's quote-unquote record of treatment of minorities, and the Prime Minister was very clear, you judge us by, you know, the welfare schemes that the government gives out to its people. There is no discrimination there, and I think both of them, the Prime Minister and the President, said democracy is in our DNA. The question I'm asking is, you know, India is not a perfect democracy. America is not a perfect democracy. But to be constantly sort of, you know, niggled about it, to be constantly, you know, asked questions about it, is that, you know, potentially, and I say, yes, you're not going to agree on every issue, but this one issue seems to be sticking out like a thorn, sticking out like a sore finger, even at yesterday's, you know, after all that pomp and ceremony at the South Lawns, in the press conference, the biggest takeaway, not just for journalists, but everybody who was present there, was the question that was asked of the Prime Minister about his record, his government's record on the treatment of minorities. Is there a narrative which may be more in perception and less in reality that Mr. Modi's government and its treatment of minorities is not up to the mark? And what is the potential of that, cause, and I wouldn't say derailing the relationship. I think the relationship is going to be fine over the next 10, 20, 30 years, but certainly sticking out as a sore thumb in this relationship. Nicole.
Well, look, I mean, there's just no doubt there are elected members to our Congress who have voiced their concerns. And part of the beauty and wonderfulness of living in a democracy, even if it's not perfect, is that journalists and the press have the ability to ask these questions. And the Prime Minister had the opportunity to answer that. I mean, that is the push and pull of being in a democracy, is having all of these thoughts and these discussions and these concerns of the ability to be brought up and put out there into the public sphere. So, that's what we were experiencing, democracy at work. But I don't think it has overshadowed this visit. I mean, this visit has had more coverage than the average state visit has to the American public. And the meeting this morning that's happening with the Silicon Valley leaders, the state dinner, what he said in his joint address, all of the agreements that are being announced, right? This isn't, we talked, we don't agree, but we had a conversation. We're announcing partnerships. That is the takeaway from this state visit. And I think, frankly, if there wasn't some dissension, it wouldn't have been happening in a democratic country.
Yeah, so I want to ask Ambassador Parthasarathy this. I mean, the criticism from the US side, I wouldn't say criticism, but this is something that officials point to, is that this is how democracies work. Maybe India is being too overly sensitive for these questions that are being asked of Mr. Modi's government. I mean, yesterday, even as the press conference was happening inside, and even as, after that, when the Prime Minister went to address the US Congress, outside the White House, there were a bunch of Khalistan protesters, maybe 100 of them, maybe 200 of them. But they were there. They were shouting their slogans. And the American view is that they are saying that, look, this is an example of how democracies work. You don't need to sort of get so worked up about a few hundred protesters outside the White House. Is India being accused of being overly sensitive to some of these issues? Or should India also turn around and say, well, just as India's democracy may not be a perfect union, neither is America's. Look at its treatment of minorities. Look at its treatment of the gun violence victims. Look at how divided this country is at this point of time. Should India start talking about that as well? Because I don't see that road is a particularly productive one.
No, I don't think so. I don't. Tit for tat is childishness. And the fact of the matter is, the Americans are the Americans, and they will keep saying they are a diverse society. Sections of society will say something. I think the Americans know that large sections of the Indian media can be pretty harsh with them also. So that's a part of the give and take of democracy. As I say, I've dealt with being there for so long. I have never seen things so good. And I think two important things. One, it has to be not just one field. Economically, America will remain our major partner. And I think for the first time, there's a recognition in America that when India seeks high-tech technology, or in the electronics and elsewhere, and most important now in what we're going ahead with, but on the semiconductor side, I think it is important that people's exchanges continue. I think it's important that we understand each other. But I would only tell the Americans, you should judge India and its governments by the people who elect them. And we change governments like you do. So I think you go along with an elected government. If you disagree with something, as long as it's pleasantly and not harshly done, as some countries do, we'll live with it. I don't worry too much. But I think Mr. Modi really spelt it out today. He spoke for all of India. I come from the south, the north and the south, and there was not any reference to any communal issue. Yes, every society has its problems, and as long as it's being looked after and being sought to be resolved, it's fine. And no country can be more diverse than India. For God's sake, we got 17 languages, you've got one.
Yeah.
That's what I tell the Americans. So the fact of the matter is, it's live and let live, but I think it is important that the world's most populous democracy and the world's most, strong democracy, powerful democracy, if I say, populous and powerful, I would say, make a good team. And I think we can do the world a lot of good together.
All right.
And that's about it. But I think what has happened in the Modi visit...
Raymond Vickery the final... Yeah, I'll give Raymond Vickery the final word. And I think, people say that there are these moments that come in a relationship, when Nixon went to China, when Rajiv Gandhi came here and so on, even the Indo-US civil nuclear deal. These were watershed moments, watershed visits, and I think this one will go down in history books as well. It's the first ever state visit by the Prime Minister. I mean, I was at the White House South Lawns yesterday, the pomp and ceremony, the regalia, and just when the national anthem played and there were 5,000 Indian Americans singing along on the South Lawns of the White House, that was incredible. I mean, it's a moment, it was like I said in some of the coverage yesterday, it was like a political rally meets a rock concert kind of an atmosphere. And I think, would that be the abiding sort of image of this visit? 10 years down the line, Mr. Vickery, how will people view these 3 days and what these 3 days meant and what these 3 days achieved?
I think these 3 days will be viewed as a hinge in terms of the relationship. Not because we haven't been working at it for a long time, and we have. It's been 25, almost 30 years since the rapprochement between the U.S. and India, and both parties in the United States have subscribed to it. But what is unique here is a looking to the future, not worrying about economic imperialism or who struck John in 1971, but looking to what two great democracies and self-confident democracies can do together. And I think that will be the major impact of the last couple of days.
All right. Thank you very much to Raymond Vickery, Nicole Brenton-Smith, and also, of course, to Ambassador Parthasarathy for joining us. It's been phenomenal these last 3 days, and the kind of, intertwined nature of India and America, and how both of these countries, from the leadership downwards, are sending out this message that they are invested in each other's future, not just for the next 1 or 2 or 5 years, but certainly for the next few decades. I sat down with Tanvi Madan, she's a senior policy fellow at the Brookings Institution, and asked her to sort of weigh in on how this visit is going to be seen. How is it being viewed in Washington? How is it being viewed in Delhi? And most importantly, how may it be judged by the history books? So it's the third and final day of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's state visit to the United States. What has been achieved? We have seen a lot of pomp and ceremony and grandeur, but in substantive terms, what has been achieved? Joining me now is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Tanvi Madan. Thank you so much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. So you've seen the pictures on TV, the state ceremonies, the dinner and all of that. But along the way, if you were to separate the wheat from the chaff, what is the substance of this visit? What will this visit be remembered for?
I think there were a phrase each that President Biden and Prime Minister Modi said that I think encapsulates the theme of this trip. And the phrase that President Biden used was that together we shall unlock a shared future. And the Prime Minister used the term a new dawn, quoting Amanda Gorman, the poet. And I think the reason they say that is because if you look at the actual fact sheets and the joint statement, what you're seeing is not just one or two deals, and they were concrete deals. This had more deliverables than I expected. But underlying all that is a tying together of the two countries' economies, societies, even militaries to some extent, with obviously the strategic autonomy preserved of India. But really to say, look, we as governments are going to enable this. But this is really about building a future-oriented economic, technological, innovation, and yes, security a relationship that feeds into our objectives of security, prosperity, and resilience. So to me, that's kind of the theme. And what they've done is they've laid the groundwork. So now it's a question of implementation. But to me, if this works, 10 years from now, we'll say this trip is historic if this gets implemented, because it has the potential to actually tie the systems together in a way that is if not unprecedented, not something that happens very often.
So we'll talk about the security partnership and all this transfer of technology stuff, but I think one of the underlying things, or at least this seemed to be sort of heard in the rooms yesterday, that America made a bet on China 30, 40 years ago, and there was 30 years of great economic prosperity between the Deng era and just before Xi Jinping came in. And clearly China could not have done that without America making that bet on China. Is America, through this visit, is President Biden, is the entire ecosystem here basically saying we're willing to make that same bet on India for the next 10, 20, 30 years because we feel that India is our natural ally. India is the partner that we're looking for, not just in the Asia-Pacific because of its own, geopolitical constraints and so on, but generally for the longer term. Do you see that message coming out of this visit?
So I don't like the term bet because it suggests it's a one-time play for a one-time payoff. I prefer the term investment because this is not just this administration. It is previous administrations from both parties. And frankly, it's also not just the U.S. making an investment. It's India making an investment in the relationship, overcoming, as the Prime Minister says, the hesitations of history. So I think this is about, but it's more than what the U.S. did with China, because I do think, it's kind of the throwaway line at the end, the people to people or the diaspora. But it is, and even the shared values, people say, oh, it's just a check, something that's checked, a box that's checked. But that's the special sauce in the relationship, which means you're tying together. It's not just a business case. So, with China, it was like, this is going to be the country that's the counterbalance to the Soviet Union. And yes, American business eventually said market access. I think this is really about, you didn't see that tying up of ecosystems. You saw tying up of economies maybe, but you're seeing the US now over the last 25 years say this is a country with which, because India for its own right, will be an important player. There is an attraction here, special attraction to the fact that India is a democracy and, like the US, is a diverse democracy. That gives it in kind of added value here. And so the idea that, and you've seen multiple administrations say it, that India's rise is in American national interest and therefore is worth supporting, is something that is not just of today, not just because of the kind of China challenge that both share. It is because of this broader economic, technological, societal relationship. Having said that, I would be the first person to tell you that anybody who tells you this is not about China is kind of being a very polite or trying to kind of not mention the C word, right? You can call it the Voldemort of the relationship. He shall not be named. I'm told younger kids get the more kind of, we don't talk about Bruno, I guess, is what they say. We don't talk about China. But it is about China in at least two ways, right? It provides the context in which the two countries are moving forward security, economic, technological cooperation because of shared concerns about China's not just geopolitical moves, but their kind of the concern about economic and technological ties with them need to de-risk. So I think China is providing that additional fuel in the relationship to really speed it up and scale it up. I think the second thing that China helps do is, because there's the strategic imperatives, the differences that come up between the US and India, they're incentivized to manage it, including on the question of Russia.
I just want to talk about, again, since you mentioned democracy, and we heard this a lot in all of the speeches that we heard yesterday. And frankly, the whole idea of democracy and shared values, it's a phrase that we've been seeing in the Indo-US bilateral for the last 20 years. But when you talk about that, I think the limits of this relationship are also sort of coming to the fore, because I think there is a realization that Indian democracy is working the Indian way, and there are certain shortfalls as the American view is, or, including on the question of minority rights and press freedoms and so on. The question was asked to both the President and the Prime Minister yesterday. What is the view on that here in Washington? That yes, while we're willing to make this bet on India and Mr. Modi and his government, but there is this little bit of an issue that's a bother.
The U.S. investment is in India, and it is just as it's been for multiple administrations here, it's also across multiple governments in India, because they do believe in the idea of India. It's also not just a values argument, right? So there is the values argument. Yes, they see India as perhaps most like America in this way. They might have partnerships with countries in the Anglosphere, but they definitely don't have the kind of diversity that India does. I think also there's always been this element of that India can prove the theory of the case, that democracy and development aren't mutually exclusive. So there is that aspect. There's also a view here which President Biden suggested in his response, that democracies tend to be less externally assertive or make fewer bad decisions externally. That's an allusion to both President Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, that they live in closed bubbles and make bad choices because of that. But I think there's also a strategic imperative that people here do see. They want to see an India that is thriving, that has the capabilities and is focused on playing the regional and global role that the U.S. wants it to. And frankly, that most Indians want India to play that larger role on the world stage. And from a strategic perspective, they're concerned that you go back to times in India's history like the 1980s, where it was so focus on internal security challenges that it couldn't play that role. So there's that strategic imperative that people see in terms of democracy. And then as the U.S. looks to diversify and de-risk through diversification, having had a bad experience with China, they are looking for partners that are more transparent, that are more open, that are more predictable. And so they see kind of the democratic side, the fact that there's rule of law in India as part of that contrast. So you do see, and it's not just, Democrats might write a letter, but even for Republicans, things like religious freedom matter. Is it a limit to the relationship? I still think on balance, democracy is more of a strength than this thing. I think people should be less oversensitive about comments that are made, because at the end of the day, you also had the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say, look, at the end of the day, what happens in politics in India is for Indians to choose. It's not for the United States to choose. So I think there's a recognition of the limits. But I think when somebody here is stating that what makes India attractive as a partner is democracy and they have concerns, I actually think Indians should be concerned about the state of democracy in the U.S. I don't think many people here would have a problem if India actually says, look, we have an interest in the U.S. that is united, that is not full of friction, because it will not be able to play a role in the Indo-Pacific that we want to. So I think it's just natural. These are open societies. People will make comments. This is not China, where suddenly, there should be an oversensitive thing. Because, if the argument is India's democracy is strong, then, as the Prime Minister did, defend it.
All right. Thank you very much, Tanvi, for speaking with us. So that was Tanvi Madan with camera person Ravinder Kumar here at the Brookings Institution in Washington. This is Zaka Jacob for CNN News 18.
Cheers.
We were strangers in defense cooperation at the turn of century. Now, the United States has become one of our most important defense partners.
The relationship with India really cross-cuts all sectors, public and private, whether it's economy, science, engineering, emerging tech. So, there's just an awful lot of cross-pollination here in trade and tech that I just think augurs really, really well for this partnership going forward.
When I first visited the U.S. as a Prime Minister, India was the 10th largest economy in the world. Today, India is the 5th largest economy. In modern India, women are leading us to a better future. India grows while being responsible about our planet. We became the only G20 country to meet its Paris commitment. We protected our people with 2.2 billion doses of made in India COVID vaccines, and that too free cost. लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारे रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं, लोकतंत्र के मूलभूत मूल्यों को आधार लेकर के बने हुए संविधान के आधार पर चलती है। जब आप डेमोक्रेसी कहते हैं, जब डेमोक्रेसी को स्वीकार करते हैं और जब हम डेमोक्रेसी को लेकर के जीते हैं, तब डिस्क्रिमिनेशन का कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता है। इंडियन अमेरिकन्स हमारे संबंधों की असली ताकत है। इन संबंधों को और गहरा करने के लिए हम अमेरिका द्वारा बेंगलुरु और अहमदाबाद में कॉन्सुलेट्स खोलने के निर्णय का स्वागत करते हैं। उसी तरह सिएटल में भारत का नया कॉन्सुलेट खोलेंगे। फ्रेंड्स, आज की बैठक में हमने कई क्षेत्रीय एवं वैश्विक मुद्दों पर चर्चा की।
Your Excellency, President Biden,
दोनों देशों के
delegates of both countries, friends from the media,
नमस्कार।
Namaskar.
सबसे पहले मैं
First of all, I thank President Biden for his warm words and for his positive views on India-America relations. Friends, today is a day that has special importance in the history of India-America relations. Our discussions today
विचारों के लिए धन्यवाद देता हूं। फ्रेंड्स, आज का दिन भारत और अमेरिका के संबंधों के इतिहास में एक विशेष महत्व रखता है। आज की हमारी चर्चा और हमारे द्वारा लिए गए महत्वपूर्ण निर्णयों से हमारी कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव ग्लोबल स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनरशिप में एक नया अध्याय जुड़ा है। एक नई दिशा और नई ऊर्जा मिली है। फ्रेंड्स, भारत अमेरिका की व्यापार और निवेश साझेदारी दोनों देशों के लिए ही नहीं बल्कि वैश्विक अर्थव्यवस्था के लिए भी महत्वपूर्ण है। आज अमेरिका भारत का सबसे बड़ा ट्रेड पार्टनर है। हमने निर्णय लिया है कि व्यापार से जुड़े लंबित मुद्दों को समाप्त कर नई शुरुआत की जाए। आईसेट यानी इनिशिएटिव फॉर क्रिटिकल एंड इमर्जिंग टेक्नोलॉजी हमारे तकनीकी सहयोग के महत्वपूर्ण फ्रेमवर्क के रूप में उभरा है। आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, सेमीकंडक्टर्स, स्पेस, क्वांटम और टेलीकॉम जैसे क्षेत्रों में अपना सहयोग बढ़ाकर हम एक मजबूत और फ्यूचरिस्टिक साझेदारी की रचना कर रहे हैं। अमेरिका की माइक्रोन, गूगल तथा एप्लाइड मटेरियल जैसी कंपनियों द्वारा भारत में निवेश करने का निर्णय इस फ्यूचरिस्टिक साझेदारी का प्रतीक है। इस यात्रा के दौरान मुझे अमेरिका के कुछ अन्य सीईओज के साथ मुलाकात करने का भी अवसर मिला उनके साथ हुई चर्चाओं में भी मैंने भारत के प्रति उत्साह और एक सकारात्मक सोच महसूस किया। हम दोनों सहमत हैं कि हमारी स्ट्रैटेजिक टेक्नोलॉजी पार्टनरशिप को सार्थक करने में गवर्नमेंट्स, बिजनेसेस और एकेडमिक इंस्टीट्यूशंस का साथ आना बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है। क्लीन एनर्जी ट्रांजिशन में भारत और अमेरिका के साझे विजन को इम्प्लीमेंट करने के लिए हमने कई महत्वपूर्ण इनिशिएटिव लिए हैं। इसमें ग्रीन हाइड्रोजन, विंड एनर्जी, बैटरी स्टोरेज, कार्बन कैप्चर जैसे क्षेत्र शामिल है। हमने यह भी निर्णय लिया कि वैश्विक अनिश्चितताओं के बीच भारत और अमेरिका ट्रस्टेड पार्टनर्स की तरह रिलायबल, सिक्योर और रेजिलिएंट ग्लोबल सप्लाई चेन और वैल्यू चेन तैयार करेंगे। भारत और अमेरिका के बीच करीबी रक्षा सहयोग हमारे आपसी विश्वास और साझा रणनीतिक प्राथमिकताओं का प्रतीक है। पुराने समय के बायर सेलर्स रिलेशनशिप पीछे छोड़कर आज हम ट्रांसफर ऑफ टेक्नोलॉजी, को डेवलपमेंट और को प्रोडक्शन की तरफ बढ़ चुके हैं। जनरल इलेक्ट्रिक द्वारा भारत में टेक्नोलॉजी ट्रांसफर के माध्यम से इंजन बनाने का निर्णय एक लैंडमार्क एग्रीमेंट है। इससे दोनों देशों में रोजगार के नए अवसर भी खुलेंगे। यह आने वाले समय में हमारे रक्षा सहयोग को एक नया स्वरूप देगा। इस सहयोग में दोनों देशों के रक्षा उद्योग और स्टार्टअप्स महत्वपूर्ण पार्टनर्स हैं। उन्हें आपस में जोड़ना हमारे डिफेंस इंडस्ट्रियल रोडमैप का मुख्य उद्देश्य है। स्पेस साइंस और टेक्नोलॉजी में हमारा गहरा और वर्षों पुराना सहयोग रहा है। आज हमने आर्टेमिस अकॉर्ड्स में शामिल होने का निर्णय लेकर हमारे स्पेस कोऑपरेशन में एक लंबी उड़ान भरी है। संक्षेप में कहूं तो भारत और अमेरिका की साझेदारी के लिए
A very warm welcome. Thank you for staying with our special coverage of Modi in America. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. It's the day 3 of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States. And after this state dinner, significant bilateral talks and addressing the US Congress along with joint press conference, Prime Minister Modi will be jointly hosting a lunch by US Vice President Kamala Harris and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. This will be followed by a one-on-one business meeting with influential chief executive officers from the United States and from India as well. And later in the evening, Prime Minister Modi will be addressing the Indian diaspora at the Ronald Reagan Center. Remember, this is going to be a special highlight of day 3 of Prime Minister's visit because remember, people-to-people ties and the Indian diaspora have in fact played a very significant role in bridging that gap between the United States and India. Let's try and get in a sense of perspective, also a bird's eye view of how Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit during these 3 days have panned out for both the countries, not just India. And for that, let me also introduce my guests today. I'm joined in by Spencer Critchley, who's a political commentator and author. I'm joined in by Kriti Upadhyay, who's a policy analyst and strategic advisor in Washington, D.C. I'm also joined in by former ambassador and senior diplomat, Mr.